The following program is a special presentation of Homeland Security Television.
Has Al-Qaeda achieved a strategic victory in its war against the United States and free societies? Some say after 10 years of instilling fear into the Homeland Security debate, Al-Qaeda has finally enabled the victory of radical elements of the U.S. political establishment to alter the fabric of American society. From indefinite detention to the deliberate targeting and killing of American citizens, we'll take a look at the evidence. Evidence that suggests our own elected leaders have taken their cues from some of the most repressive regimes in history and are hell-bent on destroying the Constitution. December 15, 2011. The U.S. Senate approves a $662 billion Defense Authorization Act. The largest, most influential media outlets in the nation say little about it. But attached to the bill is a provision that could fundamentally alter the constitutional protection of due process that all Americans are entitled to. After months of closed-door meetings, radical members of the U.S. Senate, both Democrat and Republican, craft language that they attach to the defense spending bill. It authorizes the U.S. military to detain indefinitely and without trial anybody suspected of planning or carrying out terrorist attacks against U.S. interests. Senators John McCain and Carl Levin argue that the bill does nothing to change existing law governing the detention of U.S. citizens, and therein hides the threat. The ambiguity surrounding the 2001 congressional authorization to use military force against Al-Qaeda has for years left the status of American citizens detained inside the U.S. as terrorist suspects an open question under the law. The provision's authors and supporters argue that the language does not apply to U.S. citizens, but civil rights experts point to the lack of any concrete rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court that would protect American citizens from domestic military roundups. The questions this bill raises about the future of freedom and the rule of law in the United States are profound, and they have not been lost on some in Congress.
Someday there could be a government in power that is shipping its citizens off for disagreements. There are laws on the books now that characterize who might be a terrorist. Someone missing fingers on their hands is a suspect, according to the Department of Justice. Someone who has guns, someone who has ammunition that is weatherproofed, someone who has more than 7 days of food in their house can be considered a potential terrorist. If you are suspected by these activities, do you want to have the government have the ability to send you to Guantanamo Bay for indefinite detention?
HSTV spoke to a veteran counterterrorism professional who has spent his career protecting the nation from terrorism about the alarming trend at all levels of government in the U.S. to trample and fundamentally alter the Constitution. He spoke to us on condition of anonymity because he still works on high-profile Homeland Security programs.
Theoretically, this bill supports the ability of the government to identify you as a terrorist suspect, arrest you, detain you indefinitely, without you, an American citizen, having the ability to communicate with your family or with legal counsel. This is straight out of the playbook of dictators that we have fought wars against. This is straight out of the Hitler playbook. This is straight out of the Saddam Hussein playbook. We go to war against countries, in part because we state that they have abused their people and denied them the right to protest, the right to dissent, the right to a legal, fair, legal, lawful process. Wake up, America. This has happened here.
This new detainee provision will expand the universe to include any person said to be part of or substantially supportive of Al-Qaeda or Taliban. But remember, this is not someone who's been concluded at trial to be part of Al-Qaeda. This is someone who is suspected. If you are a suspect in our country, you are usually accorded due process. You go to court, you're not automatically guilty. You're accused of a crime. But we're saying someone accused of a crime could be taken from America's soil. An American citizen accused of a crime, a suspect of a crime, could be taken to Guantanamo Bay.
The real danger in allowing these provisions to become law stems from the assumption that the government in the U.S. will remain a benevolent force of the people, by the people, and for the people. But what if we are one day facing a government with even greater authoritarian motivations? Of course, history informs us that such potential outcomes are a very real possibility. On December 7, 1941, Adolf Hitler issued his infamous Nacht und Nebel Decree, the so-called Night and Fog Decree. Originally intended to enable the security forces to ferret out members of the resistance throughout Nazi Germany, the Night and Fog Decree was expanded 2 months later to allow the German armed forces to include all persons in occupied countries who had been taken into custody. The decree was meant to intimidate local populations into submission by denying friends and families of the missing any knowledge of their whereabouts or their fate. The prisoners were secretly transported to various concentration camps, vanishing without a trace. The move toward more authoritarian rule in America did not start with the current defense bill or with the lawmakers behind the controversial detention provisions. In 2008, HSTV talked to Bernard Fennell and Damon Terrell of the American Security Project. In their report, Restoring the Rule of Law to American National Security and Foreign Policy, both Fennell and Terrell argue that American policymakers have ventured far from the familiar shores of the Constitution in their efforts to protect Americans from terrorism. The fact that many of the draconian measures introduced by the Bush administration in the first weeks and months after 9/11 remained in force years later is evidence of a systematic effort to undermine the rule of law. Other civil rights groups argue that the effort by Congress to codify indefinite detention without trial more than 10 years after 9/11 is further evidence of a systematic effort by radicals to erode constitutional protections.
It's the creation of sort of a legal framework or a quasi-legal framework that justifies and defends things which are in fact not what we normally consider legal. It's this creation of this alternative framework that it sort of tries to define the law, saying which we all know it actually isn't. And so clearly there's some areas where you talk about torture, there's clearly sort of violation of the law. What looks like the initial domestic surveillance program, clearly a violation of law. The question of holding of enemy combatants, of terrorist suspects at a place like Guantanamo, I think there's a lot more ambiguity there, both in terms of American domestic law and just international law more broadly.
The United States has had as part of its national security and foreign policy a critical component at its center, really, a commitment to the rule of law. And I saw that as having been, and I think many people do, as having been undermined systematically.
Targeted killings pose a rapidly growing challenge to the international rule of law. While over 40 states already have this so-called drone technology, the United States is the dominant user of drones to kill.
According to news reports, the Defense Department and the CIA have both compiled lists of people whom they want to kill, and some of these people are U.S. citizens. The case we're bringing is not about al-Awlaki's character or even about his alleged crimes. It's an effort to defend a right that all of us should hold dear, the right to due process of law. Everybody recognizes that the government has the authority to use lethal force in actual zones of armed conflict, in Iraq, for example, or in Afghanistan. But what we're talking about here is a use of lethal force against people who are located far away from those zones.
The United States, in particular, argues that the, quote, law of 9/11 enables it legally to use force in the territory of any other state against certain, quote, terrorists as part of its inherent right to self-defense.
Under international law, lethal force can be used against civilians only in narrow circumstances, only when it's a last resort, and only against true imminent threats. What we're talking about here is a bureaucratized program.
We want a court to issue a ruling as to the constitutionality of this plan. We want the court to issue a ruling as to whether this plan violates international law. And more importantly, we want the government to be clear on what criteria it's using in terms of determining who it's going to kill, who it wants to kill, and how it's going to happen.
We want to know why there is a need for a bill that allows for the indefinite detention of American citizens, while at the same time depriving them of a trial, of an attorney, of the presentation of any evidence in direct conflict with the Constitution. We're calling on all elected officials to rethink this. I'm going to try to find out why there's a need to have a secret warrant process that has been so mismanaged that not one has been turned down. Your freedom is under assault from within.